Hello, this is Adam Feinberg. Welcome to Harlem Stories. Can you believe it? We're in season of number 5. I can't believe it. Thank you so much for all your listenership. It's been a great, fifth year going into this. We've gotten a lot of tremendous feedback. Nobody else is offering anything like, this podcast, and it's unique and it's different. And this year, I got something a little different in plan in store over here. I have my new 2 co-hosts, Denise and Dom, and why don't I introduce them? Denise, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Adam, thanks for having me. This is wonderful. So I've been with real estate over 20 years. Been with Elegant, now Howard and Hannah, for going on 6 years. Love the business, plowing into Harlem, really trying to get my feet wet. And thanks to you, you're really, educating me on more in Harlem and all of that. So happy to be here.
And Dom.
Yes. Again, thank you, Adam, for having us. And we are so excited to be on the podcast and really dive deep into these Harlem stories. My background is I've been in real estate for about 8 years now, and I've been with Elegant, now Howard Hanna, for 4.5 years. I started doing strictly rentals, and now I've made my way into the sales market, working with buyers, sellers, investors. And when I first came to the city, I was in Harlem, then moved around a little bit, and now I'm back in Harlem. So I'm really excited to take a deep dive into Harlem and really explore these stories.
Awesome. That's great. And I love the energy that we got going here. So, today we're going to talk about a topic that's not necessarily specific to Harlem or Upper Manhattan, but this is something that I think anybody that has never bought and sold in Manhattan before, I think this is a topic that's going to be really great for, and especially those that are out-of-towners. If you bought and sold in real estate before, you're saying, do I need an agent? No, you absolutely do here. It is nothing like your experience in other locations. So today we're going to talk about the many ways that Manhattan real estate works differently than everywhere else. And I think that's really like a key for us going in.
Adam, I'm glad you brought up the fact that people think they don't need an agent, and that topic is so crucial. So maybe if you could expound on that a little bit, why it's so important for a buyer to use an agent.
Yeah, absolutely. And, first off, on that topic, we also have, and I'm going to refer our anybody that's listening, we've got a great episode on how to identify a great buyer's agent and the services that they offer. But just quickly answering your question, it's like, because the reality is, we have condos, a little different than the rest of the country, but for the most part, more or less similar, or at least close, but still there's so much unique aspects to that. We've got co-ops, we've got condops, we've got condotels, we've got co-op land lease buildings, we have HDFC co-ops, and I can go on with all the little variants of our market here, but I think that is something that stands out unique and different, to our market, and the reason why it's just absolutely so important for us to have a buyer's agent, in this process.
Yeah,
and obviously, and if you're obviously on the listing side, you probably know a lot of this stuff, but I'll tell you, even when I'm working with sellers, a lot of times it's like they don't do this on a day-to-day basis. We do. So it's like they might know some of this stuff, but they might have forgotten a lot of it along the way.
Exactly. Yeah, very true. Very true.
So so we're going to talk about a lot of things in this episode, and I think we've got enough material to make it into actually a 2-part episode today. So one of the big things I want to talk about is, we're going to talk about everything from our demographics, our norms, our regulations, our lending, our legal process, and it all just works differently here. And to help those interested in understanding about this, let's break this into 3 different core sections. demographics, and I'm not necessarily talking about like fair housing type of stuff that might get us agents into trouble. Although this is a podcast, so it's not quite the same as us in an agent capacity.
Right.
But I also want to talk about rentals and sales. And while each of these have their own unique aspects, some areas will have lots of different subsections. We won't dive down into every unique aspect or every possibility out there, but we want to keep this short enough to absorb. But it's also important to also acknowledge that while there will be a small community that handles both residential and commercial as part of their business, most commercial business is handled separately from residential here. I just happened to have, at the time of the recording of this, a 5-family townhouse.
Congratulations. That's
Thanks.
wonderful.
Yes.
That's
Thank
awesome.
you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
that's
And
great.
but I think it's worth noting, and most people don't really understand this, that a 5-family is different than a 1 through 4 family because it falls into the commercial world. So, no, I personally don't view myself as necessarily a commercial broker or commercial expert, but when you're talking a 5-family townhouse, there's a lot of bleed into the residential world, and there are some unique differences, but that will go into another topic altogether. But I just kind of wanted to bring that up as just an important thing. So first thing that I mentioned is demographics. And no, I'm not, as I said, I'm not talking about the type of stuff that, that is like fair housing category. What we're talking about over here is it's important for us to acknowledge the difference in the renter versus owner population here in New York City versus the whole rest of the nation. And while I don't exactly have precise numbers on hand, approximate numbers are good enough to illustrate my point. So in most of the nation, and let's say approximately 2/3 of the population owns property. And in most of the nation, approximately 1/3 rents properties. Makes sense, right? If 2/3 own.
Yes.
So in New York City, it's almost the exact reverse of that, where approximately 2/3 of the population rents and approximately 1/3 owns. So it kind of puts that ownership world in a whole different light and a whole different perspective. So as you can see, the owner versus renter population, it's flipped, and it's almost precisely the exact opposite. Another demographic that I wanted to delve into is wealth. And you know what? It's kind of like it goes with our skyscrapers and how we do everything grand and big. And everyone in the country knows that New York City is an expensive place to live. But, over here we have thousands of renters that are millionaires or even multimillionaires. And in fact, one of the fastest growing rental segments are apartments in like the, I want to say something in the $15,000 to $30,000 range. Does that sound right to you guys?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of makes sense because I would say like in New York City, like you said, it is expensive. So I can see a lot of people not really ready to kind of go ahead and dive right in and purchasing, and maybe they want to live in the neighborhood and test out the neighborhood, and then later down the line purchase something. So I can see a lot of people coming to the city, kind of filling out what works best for them, and then if it does, then they purchase down the line.
And what we're seeing though is that luxury segment too, so they might be trying out that neighborhood, but they still want their luxury environment.
Exactly. Yes.
So yeah, that's a key difference in the Manhattan market, and understanding, one of the things that really differentiates us. So due to the high cost to move over here, tenants are also tending to stay in rentals longer.
I see that. Yes,
You see that?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. I have a few rentals. They haven't moved in a few years. The rent, of course, 3-4 years ago were much lower, and they haven't gotten that great increase. So they figure, why am I moving out of this great apartment with below market?
Right.
So people are staying.
Yeah,
because
and to that point,
rents are so high now.
And to that exact point, a lot of times the landlords, they'll say, you know what, I got a great tenant. I don't necessarily have to charge them the full market rate, because I don't want that turnover, and then the marketing of it, and
those are my clients.
Yeah, exactly. So exactly that point.
Right.
So that's one of those things. So we tend to see that the owners tend to stay in their apartments roughly 3 to 7 years, which is actually a little shorter. And I actually saw an article just yesterday on, I forgot, I think it was maybe Patch or something like that, talking about like areas of where people are staying the longest and people are staying the shortest. And it so happens in the territory of Harlem Stories, Manhattan Valley, which is on the border of Harlem, Manhattan Valley, they're tending to stay longer on average.
Interesting.
That's an interesting component of it. Due to these high costs, these owners tend to stay in these apartments for 3 to 7 years. But ultimately, what we found is they tend to get bored. So
they want something new.
So it's like,
which is good for us, right?
Yeah. So sometimes like that money is kind of burning a hole in their pocket. But I would tend to say over here, one of the things that we've seen recently that have changed since the Fed started their aggressive and regular hikes in the interest rates, it kind of stalled the sales market in the last few years, but it's pushed up the percentage of cash sales. I don't know if either of you saw the quarter 3 numbers or if it's been released yet, but I know for at least quarter 2, I think it was something like 69% of all condo and co-op sales were all cash.
Yeah, all my buyers this year were cash buyers.
Yeah.
And even up to the 2 million range, they were cash buyers.
Interesting.
Yeah,
And what we tend to see is, I know that on the true luxury market, which, for those of you that are not, acclimated with our kind of border, our categories, I think is maybe the better word to say, is that the luxury market tends to start in like the $4 to $5 million price point. And the vast majority of these luxury deals are cash sales. But yeah, even in the entry-level markets, the sub-$2 million price points, we're seeing a tremendous number of all-cash sales. But rates have now stabilized, and while higher rates impacted some, it was the lack of stability that caused others to pause. And now that these hikes have halted, and we're potentially on the cusp of another rate cut, we've had a couple of rate cuts recently, and we're potentially tomorrow. We'll see whether they wind up actually, continuing to cut as things might have stabilized.
Well, yeah, when you say rates are in a good place right now, I mean, people think, back during COVID, we're going to go back to the 3%, 4%. But those weren't normal rates.
No, they were definitely not normal.
Yeah. So I think we're inching more to where rates are now normal.
Yeah,
they've normalized a bit.
If you look at historic, and I know this is your area too, Don, with the economics background. So I know historically, interest rates have trended somewhere in the 6s or 7s even. So we're looking at it coming from like this, 3%, and in some cases even sub 3% interest rate. And by comparison, something in the 6s seems extraordinarily high, but in the grand scheme of history, it's not high at all.
No.
I'm a little older than both of you, and I remember when interest rates were two digits.
Oh yeah.
Oh wow.
12-13%.
Yeah, I think in the 1980s when my parents bought their home, I want to say that they were something like 14%.
Exactly.
Or something like that.
So these are low compared.
These are very low compared. Yes, these are.
No, however, that wasn't normal either. But if anybody's like a fan of Ghostbusters, the original movie, like they talk about, it's normal to have like 20% interest rate at like one of the open scenes where he remortgages his property, to go off and start the Ghostbusters organization.
Right, yes.
But yeah, that wasn't exactly normal. But yeah, now in Manhattan, what we're seeing is largely cash buyers. And those that are financing. And I think that's one of the trends that I haven't heard anybody else really talking about, is I think what happened is, with the interest rates higher, I think like a lot of our financing buyers have kind of said stay put, and we've seen this higher increase in the financing buyers. So I think it's kind of like offset each other in terms of like the total activity. But like, the volume of sales have been down the last few years. Anyway, to go back to our topic, finally, it's also worth noting that, renting here is such an intensive process. It's almost like the amount of work it is to buy in pretty much almost anywhere else in the nation. I know you guys have done a little bit more on the rental side than I have.
Well, especially if you're renting in a condo or a co-op, it's exactly almost like the buying process going through the application.
Yeah.
So yes, it is very intense.
And in some places, it's more difficult and to rent than to buy in other places.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
And can take longer as well.
Can take longer.
So-
Yeah, especially if you're looking to rent in a co-op.
Yeah.
It's
almost 2 to 3 months to get to actually from start to finish. The whole
start
process.
Well,
finish.
so like I haven't done rentals in a really long time,
Yeah.
and I'm like I granted, and I'm pushing that off onto others, but at the same time, one of the things I was telling people is like you have to start if you're looking at condos and co-ops, you want to start that search at least 6 weeks before. But
Yes.
you're now saying 2 to 3 months, so I'm
Yeah.
like the reality is I'm like it's gotten even tougher.
Yeah,
So that's one of the key things over here. So this naturally leads me into my second topic, and we've already kind of started talking about it, is renting. And it's the most common form of living situation in Manhattan. And I guess one of the changes that we've seen recently this year kind of upended the business a little bit I think that's becoming the new norms, is upending our business every year or every other year. But now, like broker fees. Now, it used to be that, the landlord would pay or the tenant would pay, and the tenant paid in a lot of situations. But now, it's kind of like the situation has been flipped because up until June 2025, tenants either had to select either a no-fee rental or a fee rental. And, where they might have had to pay for the broker commission to place them at a rental, typically like 7.5% to 15% of the annual rent. But as of June 2025, the law changed. And the party hiring the broker, typically the landlord, but not always, they're the ones that will have to now pay the broker fee, the landlord. Politicians enacted this new law bypassing the brokerage community, who felt that it would likely eliminate a lot of the tenants' brokers. Not really, and of course, we didn't really feel like it was going to save tenants in the long run. And in fact, we were of the opinion that it was going to be more costly. And if you look at it now, if like the landlord is now absorbing that broker fee, maybe it's going to be at a lower percentage, but at the same time, who's ultimately going to wind up paying for it?
That's what I want to ask Dom, because he and I, we do rentals. Adam, you're more sales.
More sales.
You're
yeah.
more sales. Has it affected your business any? What are you seeing?
A lot of my business has been on the landlord side.
Mine too.
And a lot of the times for my residential, just regular rental clients, they were already paying the fee. The landlord was, so it really didn't affect it as much. But for my co-op and condo clients, my sellers that were renting out their apartment, it did because they were a lot of the time having the tenants cover the broker's fee. And so when the law was changed, basically what happened was a lot of those tenants that were going to cover the fee, it actually just went into the rent.
Right.
So,
That's what I'm seeing.
so a lot
I'm
of
seeing
times
that also with my
the broker's fee just got incorporated into the rent.
Into
So
the
the rent went up. And a lot of and when this was happening, I actually had two rental deals going on or in place. And they two total separate situations. One, the tenant was like, you know what, I'm gonna just still pay the fee. We signed our agreements, everything, and then just kept the deal as is. The other client, the tenant didn't want to pay the fee, and so the owner was like, hey, if they're not going to cover the fee, this is going to be the new rate, and then that happened as well. So it's on a case-by-case basis of what affects, who it affects.
Now,
but at the end of the day, it's still baked into the price.
Now, not only is it baked into the price, but what happens at renewal time?
Correct.
That's what I was just going to touch on.
Correct.
Because the broker fee was always a one-time
Correct.
fee.
Yes.
And you renewed at, whatever
Correct.
rent. now that it's making, so it's almost like you're paying that broker fee over and over again, because now you're renewing constantly at a higher rate.
So you're
Yes.
starting off at a higher
Higher
level,
rate,
and
yeah.
now so in essence, and it's too early to know the full effects of all this. But we're three independent brokers in this room, sitting here, recording this, and we were all of the opinion that ultimately this was going to make rents higher,
correct.
and more expensive than lower.
Yes. So it's there is a give and take here. The give is your upfront cost is going to be a little bit lower because you don't have to pay 4 months upfront,
Right.
the security deposit,
Right.
the broker's
Right.
fee.
Right.
And at the end of the day, my whole spiel was if you're going to be living in a place for 4 to 5 years, it makes sense to pay the broker's fee up front because at the end of because your rent price is going to be lower. But if you're going to be there for 1 year,
It was always baked in.
correct. If you're going to be there for 1 year, then it's better to kind of have the higher rent because you're not having that upfront cost. But if you're going to be there for a long term, then it made sense to kind of put it all up front.
Right.
Yeah.
So, this is a key differentiator. Now, I know in the whole rest of the country, or almost the whole rest of the country, I think
Not
there was
really
like
worried about it, yeah.
Boston or one or two locations in the nation, but like we were one of the few places where like the tenants were actually paying a broker fee.
People never understood that. Like,
Yeah.
what?
Yeah.
They never understood. But
So
we'll see.
it was a component that kind of stood out as kind of unique in our market or close, pretty rare. And now it's kind of, well, I don't know, is it done away with really? Sort of? Not really?
It's more of just like who you're hiring.
Who you're hiring, yes.
They've kind of reworded it.
Exactly.
And that's
yes.
just who you're hiring. Instead of
Yes.
just a broker's flat out no fee or fee, it's more saying like who you're hiring or who
yes.
you're working with.
Exactly.
Right. So they
they just
basically
reframed it.
reshaped it, reworded it, whatever
Right.
you want to call it.
If the tenant hires me, he pays me. Landlord hires me, the landlord pays.
So I think it went higher. What do you guys think? Higher?
Higher,
for
higher,
sure.
higher.
So
higher.
this is
We
an
saw a rate
example,
increase for sure.
and we're gonna talk. We're gonna have a whole nother episode coming up, on regulations and how we think that's impacted the city, But in the short run, my feeling is that a lot of what we've done recently has been quote unquote popular, but not necessarily very smart, and has not achieved what they were looking to achieve. Other than it raised the politicians' popularity levels. So this is like one of those things that like we got to contend with here, but it is what it is. So just kind of moving forward in our topics because we just have so much to cover here. Rentals and condo buildings. Now I want to separate rentals and co-ops and rentals and condos.
Well, very different.
Yeah, they're very different over here. So in condos, the condo boards only have the right of first refusal, though it's rarely exercised. Meaning that if the condo wants to go in and place their own tenant in there, they have a very limited window to do that. But if they want to put their own tenant rather than the tenant that we've already found, they have the right to do that. Very, very unusual. It happens from time to time. Same thing on the sales market, but very rare. In any case, tenants need to complete the board package. It's often lengthy, and I can tell you firsthand a lot of times that they might resemble a co-op board package. So they
do.
Might,
They
a lot of
pretty
times
much
they
do.
look alike, but there's different components to them, even though they actually look alike. The board typically has up to 30 days, and there's some buildings it might be 45 days, to review and approve the tenant application or exercise their right of first refusal. Now, here's a kicker in all this. That's 30 to 45 days once the application is deemed complete. The managing agent might look at the application and say, you know what? This is not complete. So that timer doesn't start until the managing agent is happy that you've submitted all the things that
Adam,
they've
let me touch
requested.
on this.
Yeah.
You're saying 30 days. Well, I'm finding now with some co-ops that the time is reduced. It's much less. I just did a deal for a condo.
Okay.
And they say in the board package, the requirements that we want to make sure that your application is processed on a timely basis. So we have reduced the 15-day time to 7 days. So
Nice.
make sure that your application is fully complete so that we can save you that time. So yeah, from start to finish, when you have the application, you have the accepted offer, I
Right.
should say, and we start the board application, especially for a condo. That 30-day time span has been reduced.
Okay,
a
so
bit.
in essence, I guess to talk about like my position and your position, it's like I'm looking at the formality, and if you look at the offering plan, you'll probably see that like 30 or 45-day window. But I guess operationally, what you're actually seeing in practice,
In practice.
is a much shorter window than that what they're allowed to do.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
That's a really good thing for us to know because I didn't even know that myself. So I think that's an important aspect over there. Also, before I move on to co-ops, just know that there's often a lot more additional fees associated with renting in a condo than it is in a traditional rental building.
Right. Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
that's important to highlight.
Yeah, I would just take a quick dive into that. Yeah, so a regular rental application fees are $20, whereas in a co-op or a condo, they can range anywhere between $500 to $2,000. So it's a big difference.
Right.
And so that's definitely, if you are looking into doing either rental or condo co-op or just a regular rental, make sure to.
But Dom,
highlight
I've
that.
seen though with some rentals, which I did one in the summer, they ask for moving deposit of $500. So
Yeah.
some rental buildings will ask for that, but it's refundable.
Correct. It's refundable,
Right.
or they bake it into a security deposit. So that's going technically is going to get paid either way. But if you, for some odd reason, if you don't move forward with the apartment, that $20 is just that.
Okay,
Right.
and I can give a little bit of addition to that, having actually served on a condo board. So there's going to be a couple of reasons why it could be up to that like 2,000 or maybe even more.
Or higher, yeah.
Or higher. And number one, it's to try and discourage too many investors in the building.
Mm-hmm.
And number two, it raises revenue without raising those monthlies, for the owner. So that's a couple of other different perspectives of coming from at this. Now let's talk about rentals and co-ops. And this is like unlike anything else you're going to come across in the whole rest of the country.
Let's just go back though to condos.
Oh,
Just
yeah.
remember in condos, and it will probably touch on it here. There's no board review, as you had mentioned at the onset.
Yeah.
It's what's called right of first refusal. So a waiver is signed off. They've waived their right to go in and say, well, we don't want your tenant. We want our tenant. So they've waived that right to rent that unit.
So you're absolutely correct that there's no board review, except you're wrong that there is board review. You're technically absolutely correct, but from just like a practical matter of serving on my condo board, my managing agent was sending me those rental applications to review. And technically,
I'm talking a personal
Interview.
interview,
Yeah,
not
interview.
review. Interview.
Interview,
Oh, interview.
Interview. That's
Yeah.
what I meant.
So,
Interview, not
but,
review.
But even
interview.
still, like that board process and whatnot, like I actually do, even though like I was reviewing the paperwork, I didn't have the ability to reject that tenant.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm like, basically, I got to rubber stamp it and say, yeah, as the condo board president, I'm like, I've seen the application, like I reviewed it, but I can't reject it.
Yeah.
Right.
So it's like you're technically right and you're technically
Well,
wrong.
I meant interview, not review.
Yeah, and the
yes.
interview. So, and that's where we come into more of the co-op world. And this is what makes it distinctly different. So in co-ops over here, co-ops can reject anybody they wish as long as it's not applicants in protected classes and deemed discriminatory. Tenants, have to complete a board application, which is often a deeper application, not necessarily in what they're asking for, in their expectations.
Mm-hmm.
So, in essence, they might ask for like the let's say bank statements and in a condo, and they might ask for bank statements in a co-op. In a condo, it's like, okay, this is their balance, and okay, we check the box. In a co-op, they might ask for the bank statements, and they might be looking at all the individual transactions. So when I say there's a different process, even though they're asking for the exact same things often, it could be a very much deeper dive in a co-op.
Yes, absolutely.
So that's one of those things that, I think is important over here, and it's a deeper expectation. It's also rather common for the tenant to be interviewed by the board, as you pointed out. And, I don't know if you've ever seen this in the rental, but I know on the sales side, certainly, pets are sometimes interviewed.
Yes.
I haven't gotten that one yet.
I've seen that.
Yeah,
Yes.
I haven't gotten
Yes,
that one yet. Yes.
Okay, so, we go through all sorts of crazy stuff to prepare our buyers, for that. But I guess it happens occasionally on the rental side too. Also worth mentioning is additional fees that didn't apply to a rental building apply in a co-op. And, again, it could be those really ultra high fees because the owners might not, or the board members and the owners might not want to necessarily, basically say, we want a building full of rentals, so they'll try a lot of times to discourage it, and they can reject. So, realistically, the restrictions are often greater in a rental, in a co-op than in a rental building.
Now here, sorry, Dom, I know.
No,
here, your 30 to 45 day does apply because what has happened to me more than once, and I always ask this as I'm taking an application with a managing agent, does the board meet as needed or once a month? So you have to make sure if the board is meeting on the 5th of the month, every month, you better get that application in at least, not on the 5th, but at least 10 days before, so the managing agent can review it and get it to the board when they actually meet. If you miss that day,
You gotta wait.
You gotta wait. You gotta wait. And that's happened to me. It has happened to me.
I actually, and I don't know about this, but in a rental in a co-op, I know on the sales side this often applies, but a lot of times the board takes the summer off.
Yep.
Does that?
Yes.
Summers,
yes.
holidays.
Yes.
They take time off.
They
gotta take time.
But
for
you have to
themselves.
understand, these people, they don't work. They
Right.
don't get paid.
Yeah.
This is all volunteer.
It's
Yeah.
volunteer.
So they live their life,
Correct.
and
This is not their top priority.
Exactly.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Your application is not our top priority in my life.
So
is.
that's an important point to know that if you're looking to rent in a co-op, that timing is everything in a lot of these buildings. So I think that gives our listeners a reasonable point of view in terms of the rental side, and we've now also covered demographics.
Hope we haven't confused them too much.
Yeah.
Or turn them off.
Yeah. So now let's talk about buying.
Yeah.
So this is really where I shine and where I spend all
We all
of my
shine.
time. Yeah, we all shine. We all shine. And this is really where I spend my time over here. So approximately, and I think some of these details really help distinguish us from any other market. So here, about 70% of our inventory are co-ops. Approximately 30% are condos, which are a lot more flexible. And squeezed somewhere in those percentages somewhere is about 1 to 2% of the homes sold are townhomes. And townhomes are often called brownstones, but a lot of people tend to mix up that term, and they're not all brownstone. Yeah. They could be limestone, they could be marble, they could be brick. They could be any number of finishes, but I call them townhouses, but a lot of people, substitute townhouses for brownstones. Unattached home sales are extremely unusual, and the sales count is really too small to be included in the sales data. And I think Upper Washington Heights, you start seeing some unattached homes, especially right around that Columbia Presbyterian Hospital area. You'll tend to see some of these unattached homes, but Aside from that, I hardly ever see unattached home sales.
Very rarely.
Yeah, very rare.
Yeah. So, that's not usual conversation that we wind up having, but I think for somebody that doesn't live here, they might not recognize that aspect. Mm-hmm. So I think it was important to really make that into a distinguishing feature. Now, townhouse sales, and I want to bring this, forward, because it is something that is such a small demographic. I don't want to lose sight of it. So, let's talk about townhouse sales just really quickly. They can be nearly identical to purchasing anywhere else in the nation unless there is a rent control or rent stabilized unit within the home, or the home is classified as an SRO, or single room occupancy. And those are a lot more complicated, and we're going to have a full topic on SROs coming up. So stay tuned, and we'll talk more about those. But you can find those as more the entry-level homes, generally not financeable though. But in terms of the townhomes, there are some instances where the home is configured in a way that doesn't match its legal filing, and it gets more complicated. But most townhouse sales resemble home sales like the rest of the nation. So it's not a dramatically different purchase process unless you're talking the SROs or those rent-controlled, rent-stabilized types of situations. So I wanted to kind of bring that forward because otherwise it'll get buried over the condo co-op conversation, which is approximately 98% of our sales.
Yes.
So over a much longer horizon, around half of sales in Manhattan were all cash purchases. But since COVID, all cash sales have been an even larger percentage of the total sales. In quarter two of 2025, all cash sales represented an all-time high of 69% of all sales. That's crazy.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah,
That's
especially when you consider the prices
Right?
here. Yeah, I know. It's like even baffling to a lot of us. It's just like crazy. But then again, it's like you start pulling each individual agent and you're like, you know what? Yeah, this makes sense. Mm-hmm. And so financing, when we start getting into that, you know what? That's a whole different world too. And we'll get into the financing over here. So what's included and what's excluded, in a sale? And I had to deal with this issue not too long ago. So, especially, and I'm sure if anybody has shown some sponsored sales in new buildings and they're staged, well, wait a minute, hold your horses, because the staging furniture is not included in the sale.
No.
So, a lot of people think that they can be. So I was working from a client, a European client, and he said in his country, it's actually pretty common to be able to buy the furniture that's in the home. And, so he thought he could just buy the furniture of the staging, and it created all sorts of process problems for us, because ultimately they didn't, in the multiple buildings we went to, it's like, nope, they don't want to sell the staging furniture.
No, I've never come across where, the furniture is for
every
sale.
once in a blue moon.
Once in a blue moon.
Once in a blue moon.
They might say, well, you want to, we can include a couch or something. But
right.
Yeah.
Or it might be somebody that's leaving altogether, and they're like, what, we'll throw it in for an extra X dollars or something like that. Correct. Meanwhile, the attorneys, they hate that.
Yeah.
They if you're gonna have to do it, it's gonna be an itemized list, and it's a whole to do. And anyway, so typically though, all the appliances are included in the sale of the property. I know, down in Florida where my parents were living all this time, last 20-something years, what I could say is washing and dryers don't necessarily are not included in the sale.
Really?
Yeah, but here, all the appliances are included, unless it's specifically stated that it's not. But I'll tell you, in all the deals that I've ever done, it was always included. So,
and it should be in working condition.
And it needs to be in working condition. Yeah. So we consider as is, as acceptable. Mm-hmm. So it can have a little wear and tear, but it's got to work. Mm-hmm. So there have been instances where a washer dryer is installed in the apartment without authorization. Or maybe the board only approved the washer dryer for the current owner, grandfathered in, but will not be approved with the sale. So we come across that, in numerous situations. but I think we have to make sure when we're working in sales if it's going to be grandfathered in, whether it's going to be needs to be removed before the closing. This is something that needs to be communicated early on.
I was just going to say that, and that's why going back to your, our initial conversation about buyer's agent, that's where we come in.
Right.
That early on, as you say, these questions must be asked. That when we do show an apartment, hey, my client is interested in making an offer, are all these included? Light fixtures, whatever.
Actually,
but
I wanted to especially focus on light fixtures because that is the one aspect that tends to be the fuzziest.
Yes, absolutely.
I almost had a deal fall through because of that.
Yes,
Crazy.
I'm sorry.
That is so true.
Yeah, and that is something like, especially like the chandeliers. It's usually not like the track lighting.
No,
it's usually like the chandeliers.
Like,
are
where
fancy.
did it go?
Yeah.
I thought,
So we had, for example, I was working with a seller, and they it wasn't included in the contract that the chandelier was. It was like a Amazon home or something like that, and we did the walkthrough and it was gone. and the buyer was like, I really liked that piece, and I wanted it to be in the apartment. And they were like, I don't know if I want to move forward. And it was a day before the closing.
Wow.
And at the end of the day, the seller was like, this is the price point for this thing, and they just ended up giving them a credit for the fixture, but.
The sellers really liked their fixture.
Yeah.
They wanted that.
Yeah. The seller wanted to keep it for their next home.
Right, exactly.
And the buyer wanted it as well.
But you're so right. Light fixtures.
Make sure you communicate that on the buyer and seller side.
Yeah, and I know when I go to a listing appointment, that's one of the things I bring up. I'm like, is there anything that you want to specifically exclude from the sale?
Yes.
Because you're bringing up the concept early. It doesn't matter whether they have an answer right then and there.
Yeah.
What matters is you're bringing it to the front of their mind.
Yes.
Because sometimes they don't think about it.
They don't think
until
about it.
It's not there anymore.
But they're not even saying, take that, take that. They're like,
yeah, exactly.
No, it could have been the listing broker's, fault for not specifically asking the question, or it could have been just the seller just never communicated, never even thought about it, and just took it.
Took it.
Yes, so I mean that does happen.
Yes.
But as I mentioned, typically furniture is not included, and I think that's typical in most of the nation anyway, because it's considered personal property. But because we have so many staged homes here, I think it comes up a little bit more frequently. Yeah. So New York City has a lot of regulations. Some are needed due to the combination of older buildings and the fact that we have these really ultra tall buildings. The two largest and typically most expensive regulations right now are Local Law 11, which is a mandatory inspection of the facade every 5 years for buildings taller than 6 stories, and Local Law 97, energy efficient buildings and clean emissions. So, over here, that plays into numerous things of special assessments and financing, and I think that's something that I wanted to get a little deeper on.
Yes, our audience should understand that if it's within a condo building and either selling or renting, that the landlord has no control over Local Law 11.
Right.
Absolutely. They're only responsible for within the walls of their apartment, not outside. I had a whole deal sort of upended because of Local Law 11.
Haven't we all, right?
Yeah, because they wanted the landlord to do certain things, which was out of her, she tried everything to appease and answer their questions, but the deal died because of Local Law 11. A landlord, even the managing agent, the superintendent, has no. They don't control Local Law 11. The city does.
Right.
The city
and
does.
and here's the kicker, and I think I don't want to go too deeply into Local Law 11, but one thing that I will say, and it's just really common here, is that Local Law 11 is often impacted by our winters here. So a building management can be doing everything right to maintain the building. But what happens in the wintertime, we have this freeze, then thaw, then freeze, then thaw cycle.
Should we explain to them exactly what Local Law 11 is?
So it's a facade inspection, and a lot of times it could be we could wind up needing to spend a tremendous amount of time and money for broken bricks and mortar. And that freeze and thaw cycle impacts, if a brick or the mortar behind it can wind up basically needing maintenance work.
And that's why it was enacted, 1996, I think?
It was sometime, I think, in the late 90s,
In the
but
late
I'm not
90s.
sure. But what wound up happening was basically an element of the facade, especially this being Harlem Stories, an element of the facade fell onto a nanny and a baby.
Right.
Did it kill the nanny?
I don't remember, but yeah, it's to prevent the bricks from falling on our heads.
Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Safety.
This
Safety
is
first.
also the reason why there's sidewalk sheds all throughout the
All
city.
throughout the city.
So
and just know that your balcony will not be in use during. So
balcony use and
Right.
that's a whole. I mean, we can go into a whole episode on Local Law 11.
Yeah.
So I don't necessarily want to go too deeply into that, but and then obviously Local Law 97, which is kind of like the Green New Deal, in Manhattan. I don't really want to go into that too much of that now, but the reality still comes down to is these are things that impact our buyers and sellers significantly, and it's our job to kind of work with these kind of scenarios and with the building management, our
Correct.
clients
Yes,
and all these types of things. So the financing also tends to get more complicated here. So there's a lot of different reasons for the financing being, that. And we did cover it a little bit in our financing episode. I would like to kind of update that, bring in a banker and, say, hey, how is Local Law 11 impacting, the financing today?
Well, we know that most banks won't approve in a building that is undergoing Local Law 11.
Sort of. So
Yes.
the building has to. Well, it depends on.
Yes.
It depends on a few different factors.
Right.
Number one, it's like the financing component, the special assessments, but also whether the building is considered either SWARP, which is safe with a repair and maintenance program, or whether it's unsafe.
Right.
If it's unsafe, then you've got some challenges. Yeah, and it doesn't necessarily mean that the building is unsafe. It just means that there are elements there that have tipped over into the unsafe category.
Correct.
And it's a whole big thing. Anyway, Local Law 11 is complex, but yeah, it kind of tips us into that world. But also, and this is what us finance economics people are a little bit more familiar with, that a lot of buyers just have no clue about. They might know the big terms about this, but they might not know how all this interplays with each other.
The nuances, yeah.
The nuances and all this. So I talk about the difference between portfolio lending and agency lending. Now, agency lending is kind of, and everyone has heard of these things. They might not necessarily know all the detail, but things like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, we call them agencies. And FHA, and they're all lending agencies through, that are quasi-governmental. And I'd say something like upper 90-something percent, let's say it's 96, 97% of homes throughout the nation are getting agency lending. Only a very small percentage, I'd say it's under 5% of the nation, are financing their homes through portfolio lending. And portfolio lending is where the bank holds the loan for themselves. They're not ultimately selling it to the agencies, and then what the agencies do gets into my old world of mortgage-backed securities. So they package these multiple mortgages up, and they sell them as securitized products. Most of the country is doing this agency lending stuff. Now, only let's say, under 5% of homes are doing portfolio lending. And in Manhattan, approximately 60% of homes in Manhattan are portfolio lending. So this is a key difference. This means you cannot go to Rocket Mortgage. Rocket Mortgage does not offer portfolio lending. I'm not saying that Rocket Mortgage is a good bank or a bad bank. I'm just saying that, as of I last knew, if you start looking into the fine print, they don't offer portfolio lending. So it is something that a lot of lenders do not necessarily offer, or maybe you might have within like a large bank. Let's just use Citi or Chase as an example. Maybe there's one banker that has a very astute, very sophisticated underwriting team. Maybe they're going to allow for portfolio lending, whereas another banker you might speak to might not allow portfolio lending. So it's all very nuanced. You definitely do not want to speak to somebody in the Midwest from a call center because you got a flyer from Citibank, with this great teaser rate, because it doesn't apply here. Or there's an odds are like whatever they're advertising doesn't apply there. They might be able to work with you to get it to work, but the reality is you're better off working with a local lender here. So these are some of like those, those things that we tend to get more involved in. Also in terms of financing, and I know we deal with this a lot up in Harlem, because there have been buildings, Hamilton Heights, Washington Heights, there have been buildings all throughout the city that have gone through this process. The difference is, if you look below 96th Street, a lot of those buildings went through the process in the 1990s, that a lot of what's happening in Harlem today is happening now from a financing perspective, and with the sales of sponsor-controlled units. So, like, if I take the Upper West Side, for example, and a building was going to convert from rent-controlled and rent-stabilized units, and they had some vacant units as well, and then they convert to condo or co-op, all of that conversion process happened probably in the early or mid-90s. In Harlem, a lot of that stuff didn't start really happening into the 2000s. So a lot of times, and I deal with this in the Riverside Drive portfolio of buildings, a lot of those buildings are still 50% or more rent-controlled, rent-stabilized units. So how does an underwriting team evaluate that? Well, that goes into portfolio lending. So, all of these kind of nuanced things come into play. Now, I bet you, if you look in most cities throughout the country, you're not dealing with these kind of issues. So again, when we talk about how everything is different in Manhattan, this is really a great example of all of it. Next, let's go with unusual property types. So we have co-ops, and banks will finance, but it's actually not considered a mortgage. I think we all call it a mortgage, but the reality is it's a personal loan. So again, that does not fall under Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac or any of the other agencies. So you get into these weird, complicated aspects. We also have condops, we have condotels, we have SROs, we have HDFCs, we have land lease buildings. All these things are not going to be handled easily, financed with your local banker from some other city. So now I actually had a client over here that was coming from, I think Iowa. I want to say Iowa. He was coming from Iowa, coming over here. His banker, was based in Iowa, but actually owned an investment property on Union Square.
Oh, wow.
So I'm like, in that case, I'm like, you know what? Absolutely. We'll work with your lender. This guy actually knows the in and outs of Manhattan lending, even though he's an Iowan banker. So that doesn't happen too often, but it does.
But
happen.
does he have to be licensed in New York?
Yeah, he had to be licensed in
yes,
New York, but
yes.
Licensed in New York State versus doing business in New York City are two different things.
Very different.
Yeah.
Very
So
different.
I'm like in New York State, more likely than not. Now I know, especially now with our Howard Hanna edition, I know you can find co-ops in a few in Rockland, a bunch in White Plains area, Yonkers, New Rochelle, Mount Vernon. So our Howard Hanna offices there, they're probably dealing with it. I know in north of Bergen, New Jersey, in Bergen County, I know they have some co-ops, but you're all talking the peripheral of New York City.
New York,
So our Howard Hanna office mates, outside of the city, they might be familiar with some of this stuff, but generally speaking, you don't really encompass this too much in other places. I did not actually know this until I was on a national blog, but the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. is a co-op.
Oh, wow.
Really?
Yeah.
So DC has co-ops. They're not.
That's interesting.
DC and like Maryland, they have some co-ops. It's not common. They do have some, but yeah, I found out the Watergate Hotel part of it is a co-op.
That's very interesting.
But yeah, in most of the country, these are not really common scenarios. So I think we talked about like the financing component. How this is all different. So let's jump into the next topic. Condos versus co-ops. Now, I already have some great episodes on condos versus co-ops, and and I've created a side-by-side chart for my buyers to kind of see really quick and dirty how these two various property types interact with each other or how they're different. So I don't want to go too deep into that, but a quick recap. Condos, you're buying stock in a private corporation with a proprietary lease tied to a specific apartment. There's often high barriers to purchase in a co-op and multiple financial qualifiers. So typically you're going to put down at least 20%. Some buildings are going to be stricter. Very rarely do we come across a building that's not that strict, but usually 20% is the starting point of the down payment. They're looking at debt. The co-op boards are looking at debt-to-income ratios of 28% or less. They might even be looking for 25%. And I even encountered one sale where it was a 20% debt-to-income building. They're also looking for what's known as 2 or more years of post-closing liquidity. So post-closing liquidity is the cash or cash equivalents that you have after you factor in the down payment and the closing cost. It's the cash that you have at the end. Now, typically, you're not going to be able to include retirement funds in that unless it's liquid, meaning that the only people that can actually access that as part of a co-op purchase, they're usually going to be of retirement age or older. So 59 and a half, that's the only way that you're going to be able to use those numbers in your post-closing liquidity. But they're also going to want full transparency of the buyer's financials, including your tax returns, personal and professional reference letters. So I can tell you that for a couple, it's often a total of 12 reference letters. Yeah. 12. Let me repeat that a third time. 12 reference letters. Now, for each of you, that's going to be 3 personal and 3 professional. This is the norm. The building might vary, plus or minus, but this is the norm for each of you. So
and also a bank reference letter.
Yeah, there's other reference letters too. So you're going to need from your employer. There'll be a bank reference letter, the co-op boards are also going to look at like the buyer's social media, and all sorts of things. So the board can reject for any legal reason and not disclose why. The co-op board can also reject and later accept an applicant if they feel the sales price is too low.
Yeah.
Co-ops represent about 70%. Now, I know I mentioned this earlier, but I want to repeat that here. Co-ops represent about 70% of the apartments available to purchase, and they tend to price about 15 to 30% cheaper than a condo because not only the supply and the risks associated with the barriers to purchase, but it's also the fact that condos tend to be rarer. Yeah. So co-ops don't actually offer square footage calculations as you're purchasing shares in a corporation and not exactly it's not real property. Though some brokers, they want to give the buyer a reasonable sense of the home size, and they'll provide an estimated square footage. And if the size is listed, this is very much an estimate and should not be substituted for your own needs. So I always tell buyers, I'm like, don't necessarily like use the square footage as like your end all be all. It's meant as a guideline, but like see how it feels. If
bring
it
your tape measure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, bring your tape measure, to make sure your furniture fits and whatnot, but don't go by using whatever that estimated number is. Yeah.
Going back to co-ops not disclosing when they reject, wasn't there something in Westchester, a law passed that, I know it doesn't, of course, affect New York, Westchester laws,
right?
That they now have to disclose, and that there's something on the books for New York down the road that they will have to disclose, but nothing has been really heard of that.
So
recently,
actually, I did see an update in the last week or so. So it is very much back on the table in New York, and You know what? I kind of
No,
have fixed
yeah.
feelings about it, but yeah, it's one of those things that is a conversation in New York City, but it is law in Westchester.
Right.
So in Westchester, you have to disclose all those things that the board is looking for, and if they reject, they have to disclose why they've rejected. So that 28% debt to income ratio, whatever number they use, they have to disclose that in Westchester. And yes, that is still being talked about in New York.
Okay.
It's rumblings for now, but that's
Rumblings, that's all it is. Rumblings,
but it does seem to be back on the table in New York. So if a married couple is buying a co-op, both the co-op board is likely going to require that the purchase is to include both partners, and they'll both need to complete the board package. I get that a lot of times because people are, in other parts of the country or pretty much anywhere else, they're accustomed to saying, I want to put it all under my partner's name. And the reality is you can do that. And you can still do that if you're buying a condo. But in a co-op, nope. You both partners need to be on, on that
They
board
want to know
application.
what's going on in the apartment.
Yeah. So, that's a component. Monthly charge breakdown. In a condo, the common charges are shown and the property taxes are shown as a separate number. So when you're looking at condos and you're shopping for condos, make for the full monthly charges, look for those two numbers. And even possibly a third number. The third number is if there's a special assessment going on in the building. And you might be able to negotiate that, you might not, but that's but be aware that could be.
Now, of course, when it comes to property taxes, of course, we can't foretell. But if you're purchasing anywhere between close to June, where it adjusts every June, you want to go on the finance website and see what's going on, and maybe even speak to the managing agent. Say, hey, do you know if there's going to be any increase in the property taxes? It's important to know that because they could close after June and their property taxes are
Higher.
much higher. So
I think that's a really important point that you bring up, because if you think about it, like in a condo, we know that information. I think it's in January or February that information is released.
Oh, it is. All right. Okay.
Well, in a condo though.
In a condo.
Okay. So in a condo, that's released through the city. So now, granted, a lot of agents, and I think this is the reason why I think it's so important to bring up, because a lot of agents, they have their listing up in June and they don't roll it over into July, and they forget that there's, that the fiscal year in New York City starts July 1.
Yeah.
And they don't adjust it. And this gets into all sorts of arguments and disputes. Now, in a condo, it's easy to look that up because an agent can just go and look, the block and lot, or just the address and the apartment number. Sometimes it's that simple. And they can look at what the property bill will become.
Right.
So in condos, it's just that easy to avoid that dispute. A lot of times, they're not doing it. And I know as a buyer's agent, that's something I'm cognizant of, and I'm on the lookout for my clients around that time of the year.
Yes.
I just double check, regardless
Yeah.
if my client is interested, and we're thinking about putting an offer. I just double check and just make sure that.
You know what? That's not a bad idea.
It's a good thing to double check, because what I found when I double checked with the taxes on a condo that was being purchased, that the seller was in arrears in their taxes.
Now, they would have to cover that at the closing,
Well,
but
right.
it could be an issue.
It could be.
So
Yeah.
Within closing. Yeah.
I said to the attorney, did you guys see this? And they said, good catch, Denise.
Yeah.
Good catch. And so,
Because,
of course,
yes,
yeah,
the
because
technical answer
because
is
a clean
yes, they
title-
have to pay it.
Yeah,
but-
a clean title. It has to be a clean title before
Right.
going to closing.
Correct.
So all of that would have been, needed to be taken care of. But it's again, as a buyer's agent, you want to be proactive. When the attorney takes over, it doesn't mean you relinquish all responsibility. You still want to be, in the deal at that time also.
Now, I got to say, I think that's not only an important point, but I lost a big deal earlier this year over the summer because I was on the buyer side and the listing agent lied about a lot of stuff, and I was the one catching all of the lies and bringing it to the attention to the attorney. So this is like, my client really appreciated. Now he's heartbroken about the situation, but he really appreciated that I was looking out for
You're his
interests.
advocate. Yeah, you're looking out, and that's what we are. We're a buyer's advocate.
Even though like the attorney has the deal sheet, they weren't present for all these conversations.
Correct.
And
Exactly.
So like at the same time, it's like, to your point of where you still need to be involved. And even though you
might, the word I was looking for.
Yeah, and it may very well be that like everything is going smoothly and you're dead quiet, but that doesn't necessarily mean that like we're dead quiet behind the scenes.
Right.
We could be doing things behind the scenes and verifying and checking and whatnot. Now, if everything is accurate and going smooth, you might not hear a peep from us, but it doesn't always work that way.
I always ask, I always say to the attorney, I said, I'm not taking over your business, but I'm a very nosy broker, and I keep my eyes on everything. And if the client brings in their own broker, I ask very transparent questions. I said, do you understand the nuances of doing a co-op or a condo deal in New York? Because I need to advocate for my client. And a lot of times the attorney will come back and be like, Denise, that's a fair question. Yes, we have done many deals in New York. So I'm like, okay,
anytime there's a showing, whether I'm on the buyer side or on the seller side, I'm always looking up that other broker's background. Before we go in and before we're actually even physically meeting, I'm like, what kind of experience do they have? Do I need to walk them through things, or do they really know? And going back to the property tax question of that June-July switchover period, the other thing, especially because this is Harlem Stories, the other thing for us to be cautious of is the roll-off components of the 421A abatements. And the rare J51s, but those are rare. But in any case, the 421A, that could be a huge difference per month. My property taxes are $3.52 a month with the abatement. Now they're going to start rolling off, and it's going to increase dramatically. Now I don't know what it's going to be, at the ending number, but let's just say if I knew what it was today, I know that my property taxes are going to go from $3.52 a month today, versus if there was no tax abatement, it would be $700 a month. Percentage-wise, that is astronomical. So I'm like, that could be a big shock. Now, granted, the reality is it comes to like $141 a month differential. Now, in the grand scheme of things of purchasing a Manhattan apartment, that's not a killer. But at the same point, if you're not raising that question up, it's going to be like $140 a month every year.
That you weren't counting on.
Year one is $141 and whatever it is. Year two is going to be twice that. So and until it rolls out the full amount. So that's part one of it. And the other part of this that that I didn't get into is co-ops and property taxes and co-ops. That you already raised the question, since it's not transparent to the agents and being able to look that up. The managing agent does know that, and whether that's going to impact the maintenance going forward. So I think that was the other important point that you brought up. And but for co-ops, when you're first looking at them, instead of having those two numbers, there's often just one number, and that's the monthly maintenance, and that includes the property taxes built into all this, and it's baked in. But for both building types, there could also be additional monthly charge, which I mentioned with condos, a special assessment to address repairs, upgrades, or just to replenish the reserve fund after work has been done. Condos tend to be fewer in number, they're easier to buy and sell, and they tend to be more expensive. Most condos tend to be newer construction, but you can find pre-war variants. But in smaller numbers, you'll be able to find those pre-war. Most of them tend to be newer construction. So we've talked a lot, and we've only covered part 1 of 2 of this topic, and we've been going for just over an hour. This is a lot longer than our typical podcast, but I think this was really important stuff. But hang in, stay tuned, and listen for part 2, and we'll be back with you soon.
We'll be back.
See you soon.
See you soon.
Thank you very much.